Hi, thank you for joining me here today. I'm here to talk with you about the latest version of the Open Source Way, the guidebook for community management best practices. My name is Karsten Wade, and I'm a community architect in Red Hat's Open Source Program Office. Although I served as project lead for the 2.0 release, I am otherwise one of the many writers, editors, community experts, and open source practitioners who worked on this guidebook. And you can find a full list of contributors at the end of the guidebook, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this is an opinionated guidebook, but frankly, much of the really good guidance and practices around creating and sustaining an open source project is fairly well known by experienced practitioners. Not a lot of secret sauce here. But the impetus for this project came out of a number of discussions over recent years in response to ongoing growth of new communities and people who are new to open source in general. The consensus was that there is a need for a guidebook written by a community of practitioners for all open source practitioners, bringing a diverse range of experiences, but having a common understanding of what makes a practice best. Now, there are many ways to share knowledge and learn. This guidebook by this community is really more for the reader and practitioner who enjoys or prefers and learns best from and among a group of like-minded people, people who like to form as a community of fellow learners and practitioners. So this guidebook is centered on community management best practices, and it allows you to start from the very beginning with with working with the open source way and your idea for an open source project. And it carries you all the way through to the creating, the creating and the sustaining of your project, from attracting users to when they pass over your scant barriers to contribute to become contributors. So before jumping into the guidebook and showing you around, let's take a moment and review the overall community growth method in the guidebook. The method is generally mapped to the sections of the guidebook, which are getting started, attracting users, guiding participants, growing contributors, and measuring success. So when starting, you want to do the harder work of being completely open and transparent from the beginning. Even when there is no one there watching you be open and transparent, putting up the infrastructure of participation with barriers appropriately lowered for users and contributors when they get there. You do all of this while focusing on building something for your users. And you make sure that when those potential users arrive at your website, at the top of the web page is a short description of the project's software. It should include a purpose that users can understand and imagine. It should give them something to do right there, a call to action, download and try out, log in and try out, a quick start to use, and so forth. Making software and content your users need is one of the main purposes of an open source project. It is from out of those users that that most contributors arise, from the enthusiastic advocates all the way to the most ardent contributors. And as people try out and become users and explore the world around your software, make it easy for them to participate in whatever they find. Make information easy to find and forum access straightforward. Make it easy for enthusiasts to share what they know about your project. And the idea that contributors come from users was true when open source was characterized by the hobbyist. And it is still true today when users of your software now include companies making products and corporate foundations wanting a common platform for competitors to share. So whether your users are a broad base of individuals or small organizations, or your users are some of the largest corporations on the planet, the conceptual math still applies. Of an entire corporate participant in your project, only a handful of people will contribute directly to the project in some fashion. Many others will contribute indirectly in their work supporting the overall user organization's contributions. So that's it. The bigger your user base, the bigger the pool of potential contributors. And open source projects are a type of community of practice, which is a group that gathers to share, learn, and improve practices in a particular domain that they're all interested in. In the science that studies communities of practice, there's the idea of legitimate peripheral participation, which describes how newcomers become experienced and eventually old timers in a community of practice or collaborative project. And the quote from the Wikipedia page, quote, according to legitimate peripheral participation, newcomers become members of a community initially by participating in simple and low-risk tasks that are nonetheless productive and necessary and further the goals of the community. Through peripheral activities, novices become acquainted with the tasks, vocabulary, and organizing principles of the community's practitioners. Gradually, as newcomers become old-timers and gain a recognized level of mastery, their participation takes forms that are more and more central to the functioning of the community. End quote. One important takeaway from this is that contributors don't come paragliding in from nowhere. They are made from within the project. And while it is true that people with needed skills and expertise do come directly to the projects, the desire to contribute, the process by which they arrive will often have followed some of the pathway of the legitimate peripheral participation. So in the corporate contributor example, there will have been some period of precursory activity from that sponsoring organization and so forth. And all of that will precede that uplift for that contributor into the project. And once that person arrives, they will still have to learn all the ways and means of the community before they can become an experienced member, regardless of that incoming cachet. So an important goal for a project is to be sustainable. And this is about more than the economics, although that is an important part of the conversation. All the money in the world isn't going to make a toxic community a healthy place again. A sustainable open source community is one that is able to take in new contributors and promote them to leaders without the stepping back of old timers, meaning the breakdown of systems. A sustainable community can have key maintainers able to take vacation or choose to step back from the project without it causing scrambling and struggling. So in choosing what to measure in your community, maintain a holistic viewpoint and don't get stuck on the simple first order data like average time to close a bug as the only thing worth watching and caring about. So as we get ready to look at the guidebook, I want to share some thoughts about the flow of the book. So this guidebook can be entered into in a number of ways. You can read from the beginning to the end and build your knowledge as you go. You can start with what interests you the most and follow some cross-references and skip around to read. You can come with a specific problem or a general question and find and read the content that's most relevant to your situation. And I think that's most of the ways to go through, I reckon. So the chapters are written to work as a standalone set of principles and practices on a subject. So for the most part, no chapter as a prerequisite to understanding any other chapter. When we made this stylistic choice as a way to provide the most value to the reader without spending 6 more months polishing the chapters so that they would work together smoothly and perfectly. Now, most of the chapters are co-authored by 2 or more people, with the merge work sometimes done by a third person. And while we have a style guide to follow, you can tell at times that there are different writers that have been at work on the chapter, but it all holds together well. And overall, the content has been curated and polished to be useful for different types of readers' needs. We'll continue to polish the content in future versions so the reading experience is smoother over time. That's open source content. We'll release and iterate and improvements next time. So now let's take a look at the book. Okay, let's get ourselves all the way back up to the top. All right, then. So there's a lot of differences about this book from the 1.0 version 10 years ago. The structure, for example, and the reading experience and so on. But for a sizable chunk of the core ideas, they're much the same as they were 10 years ago. Most open source principles are largely the same, or they're just somewhat evolved in that time. But there are 2 key differences to call attention to in this content from the past. Some topics that only got a few paragraphs mentioned in the past now have entire chapters. An example of this is governance. Only had a few paragraphs before. In 2009, a much less popular topic, and except beyond certain groups of people who are interested in it. By 2019, when we started outlining the 2.0 version, it became worthy of a chapter itself, and in fact is the longest chapter in the guidebook. And second, some topics were not being discussed as openly or even in many community management circles. One example of this is the chapter on community manager self-care, which is currently the second longest chapter. Okay, so this opening section here, the presenting the open source way, this is an introduction for the vision of the guidebook. And that explains how that vision is delivered in several sections, subsections within that chapter. The shape of things that are about the assumptions, what's the structure of this guide, and then this community of practice is always rebuilding itself, gets into the concept of the community of practice itself. So, and what we're doing here with this. So then we really get going in the get started section, which is the early work that you do, or even work you do before a community is formed, to establish and set the right direction from the start. So the first section here, or first chapter in here, Community 101, provides a broad overview of how to analyze your community and other communities to do for comparison. The next section, the next chapter, is a new project checklist, which is a checklist of elements that are typical and essential to starting a new project. It's quite like the one that we hand out to Red Hat engineers. And it's good for making sure that you've considered all the common stumbling blocks. So the next chapter is creating an open source product strategy. And this is useful for when you plan and prepare for creating a new commercial product out of your open source software project. So now we get into the beginning of the attracting users. And this section is relatively short because it can't tell you all the ways you can attract your special users to your unique project. But it can tell you how to keep from scaring them away when they've arrived, and how to hopefully attract them to stay a little bit once they're there, with some common important things. And so the first one here is communication norms in open source projects. And this is the heart and the soul of how to prevent or deal with difficult and toxic situations, as well as the whole range of communication practices that just simply keep things running smoothly. This ranges from project roadmaps to issue tracker best practices. And this communications chapter covers all of those pieces. So next we get to a chapter on building diverse open source communities, and it explains why and how to focus on inclusivity as the first step of increasing the diversity of your community. This chapter offers an overview of efforts by various open source communities to make projects more diverse and inclusive. It also offers initial steps open source community managers and project maintainers can take to begin building communities and projects that benefit from a diverse contributor base. So now we get to the section on guiding participants, which helps you understand the general participants and enthusiasts, although it doesn't go into and cover the special participants for your particular unique project because of that dynamic. But in general, we get into here to why do people participate in open source communities, and that's the various types of motivations that compel people to contribute to open source. So now we get to the main core of this part of the book, the thickest, most complex section, how to grow in contributors. And in some ways, that complexity is similar to the relationship of contributors to a project. It's not a simple and straightforward thing. So the first chapter in this section is from users to contributors. And it helps you consider how to create a welcoming environment for newcomers who may or are interested already in becoming contributors. The next section is what is a contribution? And this is a straightforward, concise explanation of what a contribution is, and provides some examples. And the next chapter is essentials of building a community, and it's also a concise single chapter that covers a range of essential components in building a community, kind of a go-to chapter. Next, we have onboarding. Make sure you can clean that font up a little bit. There we go. And this focuses on the basic practices and resources for bringing new contributors into the community. It describes the concept of contributor pathways as ways to help newcomers grow to become experienced contributors. So then creating a culture of mentorship covers the concept and practices for creating a peer-to-peer mentorship program. And most successful open source projects have formal or informal mentoring underway all the time, and they find it essential to contributor success. Following this is the aforementioned chapter on project and community governance, a thorough exploration of governance in open source communities. And then the chapter on community roles, which is a deeper look at the many different types of roles beyond code and other typically named contributions. It does a deep dive into documentation and then looks at other ones such as event management and so forth. And then finally, community manager self-care rounds out the contributor section, and it represents a new area of best practices for the 2.0 guide. One that I'm not sure many of us would have thought of to put in here 10 years ago. I'm talking openly and honestly about self-care wasn't as common amongst community managers at the time. So the idea for this chapter came about during a content design workshop at FOSDEM 2020 in Brussels. And in fact, I'm wearing my FOSDEM 2020 shirt to commemorate that. And the community manager who suggested this chapter, and she ended up writing the chapter in the end. And there was one note to make about this particular chapter was, as with all of our chapters, we always have a subject matter expert or SME review the content. With other chapters, many of them, the domain expertise exists within the team, so we can cross-check each other and to make sure that our work holds up. But in the case of this chapter, we asked Dr. Karen Hickson to review the chapter with the author. So next we get to measuring success, which is the final section in the guidebook. And encompasses the life cycle of a project and the metrics you can use to keep track of the health and accomplishment of your community. And it opens with defining healthy communities, which helps you understand what a healthy open source community looks like, coming from a high level right down to sort of hand-on inquiries. And these inquiries take apart and consider many aspects of a project as viewed from the outside looking in and from the inside of the project looking at itself. And then next we have understanding community metrics, which is a discussion of the many types of topics to measure with question suggestions for each topic, followed by a few sections on choosing metrics for your project. And then finally, we have the announcing the software releases, which is a step-by-step milestone-based process with templates for preparing for and announcing a software release, and how many weeks out and so forth. And finally, last but not least, we have the contributors chapter. All those folks who worked with me and on writing and reviewing and editing this book, design, everything and so forth. And these are folks from different organizations, different backgrounds. Already we've been able to create a community of practice that consists of more than just a small circle of us talking amongst ourselves about things we like. So I'm really happy about that. All right, so let me switch back over the presentation and we can round things out here. Okay. So as we come to the end, let's circle back for a moment to just talk about the open source way community itself. And it is a slightly odd thing to say we have a community of practice around communities of practice. And that is in very real sense what this is. We are defining and curating principles, practices, and stories, reasons why, from across many open source projects, and which are themselves communities of practice. And we are doing this as a community of practice ourselves. Anyway, our first efforts are around curating, creating, finding, and merging in useful resources to create for our users, such as guidebooks and courses. We'll continue expanding outward, making updates to the 2.x version series with a print version, and listening to what other things the users and contributors want next. And then another thing coming in this year is a common tool of communities of practice, or to have a meetings or a meetup of sorts, to include presentations by members or special guests with discussions among members about related topics. So I'm looking to start that schedule a little bit later in 2021. And finally, we're coming to the question and answers period. And in case you don't have any questions, here are some that I thought of for all of you out of material I didn't have time to include in the main presentation. And just as we close, take a moment to give up attribution for all of my Creative Commons source images, including the image itself that declares itself to be a Creative Commons attribution image. And finally, the last one, a grand morning for a walk. So thank you for spending your time with me and for sharing your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on various social media as Quade, or you can email me at kwade@redhat.com. And I am now available for your questions. Thank you.